The lobby of Griffin Capital Tower went quiet. Douglas Griffin stepped off the elevator and stopped. A little girl in a faded yellow coat stood in the center of the marble floor looking straight at him. "My mom cleaned this office for 7 years," she said. "Did you ever learn her name?" He went completely pale. She held up a folded piece of paper. 2 words written in a woman's handwriting. Martin Lowe. He had no idea what was coming. The girl didn't move. Around her, the lobby staff exchanged glances. A young receptionist half rose from her chair. Earl, the head of security, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, had already taken 3 steps forward before Douglas raised one hand to stop him. Douglas looked at the child again. She was small, 8, maybe 9. The yellow coat had a torn pocket stitched back up with mismatched thread. Her sneakers were clean but worn thin at the toes. The backpack on her shoulders was the kind schools gave out for free, dark blue, a small keychain of a butterfly clipped to the zipper. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that unsettled him most. She just stood there holding that folded paper, watching him with eyes that were far too steady for her age. "What's your name?" Douglas asked. "Audrey," she said. "Audrey Holt." He didn't recognize the last name. He knew he should feel something about that, but the honest answer was that he'd never had reason to know it. "Where's your mother, Audrey?" "That's why I'm here." She took 1 step toward him, just one, and held the paper out a little further. "She's gone. 3 days. She didn't come home Thursday night, and she didn't come home Friday, and she didn't come home yesterday. Mrs. Patterson next door said I should go to the police, but the police said they need more time. So I came here." Douglas didn't take the paper yet. "Why here?" "Because this is the last place she was." Audrey's voice didn't shake, but something behind her eyes tightened. "And because before she left for work Thursday night, she wrote that name down and told me she said if something happens to me, you find a way to give this to someone who matters." The lobby was very quiet now. Douglas looked at the paper in her hand. The fold was soft, like it had been opened and closed many times in the last 3 days. He thought about what it meant that an 8-year-old girl had been carrying this around, sleeping with it, probably taking it out and looking at it in the dark, waiting. He took it. Martin Lowe, written in neat, careful handwriting. Below the name a single line, Project Keystone. Server room, 2 a.m. Douglas read it twice. His face didn't change. He'd spent 20 years making sure his face never changed in public, but something dropped in his chest. Something cold. Martin Lowe had been his CFO for 12 years. They'd built 3 companies together. Douglas had been the best man at Martin's second wedding. "Your mother," Douglas said carefully, "she worked here as a cleaner, head of the overnight crew," Audrey said, and there was a quiet pride in how she said it. "She's been here 7 years. She knows everybody, Earl over there." She glanced toward the security desk. "He always saves her coffee on cold nights." Douglas turned to look at Earl. The old security chief's jaw was tight. He gave a single slow nod. "She's right." "She ever mention anything to you?" Douglas asked Earl. "Anything unusual?" Earl hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a second, but Douglas had known Earl for 15 years, and Earl never hesitated. "Sir," Earl said, "maybe we should talk somewhere private." Audrey's eyes moved between the 2 men. She didn't ask to be included. She just weighted backpack still on her shoulders, butterfly keychain turning slightly in the draft from the revolving door. Douglas looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd spoken. "My mom cleaned this office for 7 years. Did you ever learn her name?" He hadn't. That was the truth. He had walked past the overnight crew 100 times, seen them vaguely the way you see furniture, and he had never once asked a single name. "Audrey," he said, "come with us." She followed without a word, her small sneakers silent on the marble floor past the reception desk, past the elevators toward the small conference room off the security office, where Earl kept his monitors and his cold coffee, and apparently a secret he'd been holding for 3 days. Douglas held the door open for her. It was, he would think later, the smallest gesture, the least he could have done. But it was the first time in a very long time that he had held a door open for someone and actually waited to make sure they got through. Audrey walked in, set her backpack on the chair beside her, and sat down like she'd been preparing for this meeting her whole life. Outside the tall glass windows, Chicago moved and breathed and didn't notice a thing. But inside that small room, something was already beginning to unravel. Earl poured himself a coffee he didn't drink. He stood with his back to the window cup in both hands and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at Douglas. "Thursday night," he said. Around 1:15 a.m., Diana came down to my desk. She wasn't scheduled for a break, she just appeared. I could tell right away something was wrong. She kept looking over her shoulder at the elevator. Douglas sat across from Audrey at the small table. He hadn't touched his own coffee since they'd walked in. What did she say? She said she'd gone to restock supplies on the 34th floor, the executive server corridor. She said the door to the secondary server room was open. Not propped, not broken. Open. Like someone had a key card. Earl set his cup down. She said there was a man inside, standing at one of the terminals with his phone out photographing the screen. She recognized him. Earl looked at Douglas steadily. She'd cleaned that man's office every night for 7 years, sir. She knew exactly who he was. The room was very still. Audrey sat with her hands folded on the table. She'd heard this part before in pieces in the way children hear things adults think they're whispering quietly enough. But hearing it said out loud in this room with Douglas Griffin sitting 3 feet away, she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Someone was finally listening. "Why didn't she report it that night?" Douglas asked. "She was scared." Earl's voice was flat, not accusing, just honest. "She came to me because she didn't know who else to trust. She didn't know if security reported to—" He paused, chose his words, "to the people she needed to report about. She asked me what she should do. I told her to write down exactly what she saw, go home, and come back to me the next evening. I told her we'd figure out together how to get it to someone who could act on it safely. But she didn't come back. No, she didn't." Earl picked up his cup again, put it down again without drinking. "I called her cell Friday morning. No answer. Called twice more by evening. I told myself maybe she'd gotten spooked and stayed home. Told myself she'd turn up." He exhaled slowly. "I should have done more, I know that." Douglas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the note in his hand. Martin Lowe, Project Keystone, server room, 2 a.m. Project Keystone was the internal code name for Griffin Capital's most sensitive active merger, a $2.3 billion acquisition deal that had been in negotiation for 11 months. The details were known to fewer than 6 people. The documents lived on a single secured server. Access required a senior executive keycard and a rotating pin that changed every 48 hours. Martin Lowe had both. Douglas set the paper down on the table very carefully like it was something that might break. "Audrey," he said, "the night your mother left for work, Thursday night, did she seem different to you before she went?" Audrey thought about it seriously the way she did everything. "She made me dinner first," she said. "She usually just leaves something in the fridge when she works nights. But that night she cooked, rice and chicken. She sat with me while I ate." A small pause. "She told me she loved me 3 times before she left. She usually says it once." Douglas looked at the table. "She gave me the paper at the door," Audrey continued. "She folded it up small and put it in my coat pocket, my school coat, the one I always wear. She said, 'Keep this safe, baby, and if I'm not home by Sunday, you take it somewhere it matters.'" Audrey's voice was even, Precise. Sunday came. So I came here. Douglas stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the gray Chicago morning. The lake flat and silver in the distance, the traffic below moving in its ordinary, indifferent way. He thought about Martin, about the last board meeting 2 days ago where Martin had sat at his right hand and laughed at something Douglas said and passed him a pen when he needed one. 12 years. 2 companies before this one. The best man speech at the wedding. Did you ever learn her name? He turned around. Earl, he said. Pull every piece of security footage from the 34th floor. Thursday night midnight to 3 a.m. Don't tell anyone you're doing it. Don't log the request in the system. Pull it to a personal drive and bring it to me directly. Earl nodded once. He was already moving. And get Sylvia Okafor on the phone. Tell her I need her in this building within the hour and that she should not. Douglas looked at Earl steadily. Mention it to anyone in the executive suite. Understood. Douglas looked back at Audrey. She was watching him with those calm, careful eyes. Still sitting straight, still waiting. You did the right thing coming here, he said. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face shifted just slightly the way a person looks when they've been holding their breath for 3 days, and someone finally tells them they can let it out. My mom said you built this company from nothing, Audrey said quietly. She said you were the kind of man who didn't quit. She looked at him directly. She was right, wasn't she? It wasn't really a question. Douglas picked up his phone. If this story is gripping you, if you feel what Audrey carried into that lobby, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Sylvia Okafor arrived at 9:54 a.m. She walked in the way she always did, coat still on bag over one shoulder, reading something on her phone, and she stopped when she saw Audrey sitting at the table with a cup of hot chocolate Earl had quietly produced from somewhere. Sylvia looked at Douglas. Douglas looked back. Close the door, he said. She closed it. He gave her 3 minutes. The note, Earl's account, the name. By the time he finished, Sylvia had taken her coat off and draped it over the back of a chair, which was how Douglas knew she understood the weight of it. You haven't spoken to Martin, she said. It wasn't a question. Not since yesterday's 4 o'clock. Normal end-of-day check-in, nothing unusual. Good. Sylvia set her phone face down on the table. Don't, not yet. She looked at Earl. The footage, you haven't touched the system. Pulling it now, Earl said from the monitor station in the corner. Offline, drive no system log, like Mr. Griffin asked. Sylvia nodded slowly, thinking. She pulled out a yellow legal pad from her bag she still used paper always had, and wrote 1 line across the top. What do we actually have? We have a witness account from a woman who is currently missing, she said, ticking off on her fingers. We have a handwritten note naming a specific person and a specific document. We have a child who can testify to what her mother told her the night she disappeared. She glanced at Audrey briefly, gently. And we may have footage. That's what we need to establish first. It's here, Earl said. They gathered around the monitor, Douglas, Sylvia, Earl. Audrey stayed at the table but turned her chair to face the screen. Nobody told her not to. Earl had pulled the 34th floor corridor footage and the secondary server room feed. He navigated to Thursday night 1:03 a.m. and hit play. The corridor was empty. White light, no movement. Then at 1:07 a.m. the elevator at the far end opened. A figure stepped out. The gait was unhurried, familiar. A man in a dark overcoat, silver hair, catching the corridor light. He walked directly to the server room door, without slowing, without looking at the cameras, the easy walk of someone who had never once considered they might need to be careful. He swiped his keycard. The door opened. He went inside. Earl switched to the server room interior feed. The timestamp read 1:08 a.m. The man stood at the second terminal from the left. He pulled out his phone, not a work phone, something smaller and darker, and began photographing the screen, methodically, page by page. Douglas watched the monitor without speaking. The face was clear. The server room cameras were high-resolution, installed 2 years ago after a building security upgrade Douglas himself had approved. There was no shadow, no angle problem, no ambiguity. It was Martin Lowe. How long was he in there? Sylvia asked quietly. 11 minutes, Earl said. Came out at 1:19. Took the elevator back up to the executive floor. His office is on 36 inches, Douglas said. His voice was flat. Yes. He went back to his office at 1:19 in the morning. Footage shows him leaving the building at 2:44 a.m. Nobody said anything for a moment. Douglas straightened up and walked back to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down, not at the head, just in the middle, like the geometry of the room didn't matter anymore. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. 12 years. He thought about the day he'd hired Martin. A Tuesday in November, a different office, a much smaller one. Douglas had been running Griffin Capital out of 2 rented floors in a building that smelled like old carpet. Martin had walked in with a leather portfolio and a handshake that meant business, and Douglas had thought, this is the kind of person I want next to me. He'd been right for a long time. Or he'd thought he'd been right. Which was not the same thing. Project Keystone, Sylvia said. She'd been writing on her legal pad. Who at Hargrove would have the authority to authorize a payment large enough to make this worth Martin's risk? Douglas looked up. You're already at Hargrove. I'm already at the motive, she said. The merger gives Griffin a dominant position in 3 Midwest markets that Hargrove has been trying to crack for 6 years. If they know your terms before the vote, they can either block the deal through their regulatory contacts or undercut your position with the target company directly. She tapped her pen against the pad. What does Martin stand to gain? His contract has a change of control clause. If the merger collapses and Griffin Capital takes a hit, his exit package is capped at $2 million. Douglas paused. If someone on the outside were willing to pay him for the information, he could walk away with significantly more, Sylvia said. How much more depends on how badly Hargrove wants it. Badly enough, Douglas said. Sylvia wrote a number on her pad, turned it to face Douglas. $40 million. He looked at it. He didn't ask how she'd arrived at it. Sylvia Okafor had been a corporate attorney for 23 years, and she had a particular talent for estimating what betrayal was worth to the people buying it. We need to find Diana, Douglas said. Yes, Sylvia said, and we need to do it before Martin knows we're looking. She glanced at her watch. When's the merger vote? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Sylvia put her pen down. Then we have tonight, she said. A small sound from the other side of the table. They both looked. Audrey had finished her hot chocolate. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at Douglas with those steady eyes. You believe me now, she said. It wasn't an accusation. Just a fact she was confirming quietly for herself. Yes, Douglas said. I believe you. She nodded once. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a second folded piece of paper. Douglas went still. My mom left 2 notes, Audrey said. I only showed you the first one. She placed the second paper on the table and pushed it toward him. She said the second one was only if the first one wasn't enough. Douglas unfolded it. Inside, in Diana's careful handwriting, was a 7-digit number, a file reference code, and 4 words beneath it. Check the backup drive. Sylvia leaned over and read it. She looked at Earl. Earl looked at Douglas. The server room has a secondary backup unit, Earl said slowly. Automatic mirror of everything accessed on the main terminals. It records to an offline drive that's only checked during quarterly audits. When was the last audit? Sylvia asked. 6 weeks ago. So, everything Martin accessed Thursday night, Douglas said, is still on that drive. Every file he photographed, Earl confirmed. And the metadata timestamps which documents how many times each file was opened. The room was quiet again. Outside, Chicago kept moving. Somewhere on an upper floor, a board meeting was about to begin without Douglas, which would generate 3 concerned emails from his assistant that he would not read until tonight. He looked at the note. Then he looked at Audrey. My mom cleaned this office for 7 years. Diana Holt had walked into that corridor alone at 1 a.m. and seen something she wasn't supposed to see. And instead of looking away, instead of deciding it wasn't her problem that people like her didn't get involved in things like this, she had gone down to a security desk and asked for help. And then she had gone home and cooked her daughter dinner and said, "I love you" 3 times and put a folded piece of paper in a coat pocket. Just in case. "Earl," Douglas said, "get me that backup drive." The backup drive was the size of a paperback book. Earl brought it up at 11:20 a.m. in a plain gray case, the kind used for routine IT transfers. He set it on the table without ceremony, and Sylvia put on a pair of reading glasses and got to work. She'd called in one person, a forensic IT specialist named Ben Chu, 32, who did quiet work for her firm and understood the word discreet the way most people understood breathing. He arrived with a laptop and a cable and no questions, and within 20 minutes he had the drive mirrored and indexed on an isolated system that had never touched Griffin Capital's network. Douglas sat at the far end of the table and waited. Audrey had fallen asleep in her chair. It happened gradually, her head tipping sideways, her hands loosening in her lap, the butterfly keychain on her backpack catching the light with each slow breath. Earl had found a folded blazer somewhere and draped it over her shoulders without waking her. Nobody commented on it. Douglas watched her sleep and thought about 3 days. 3 days she had been holding this. Going to school probably, because what else do? You go to school and you come home and you check the door and she's still not there. And you take the paper out of your pocket and you look at it and you put it back. 3 days of that at 8 years old before you put on your yellow coat on a Sunday morning and you figure out how to get yourself to a building downtown because your mother told you to give it to someone who matters. He wondered if Diana had known when she said that her daughter would be the one to decide who mattered. Douglas. Sylvia's voice was quiet but tight. He looked up. She was leaning toward Ben Chu's screen, one hand on the table, reading glasses pushed up into her hair. "Come look at this," she said. He crossed the room. The screen showed a file access log, rows of timestamps, document names, user credentials. Ben had highlighted a column in yellow. Thursday night, 1:08 to 1:19 a.m., Ben said, keeping his voice low. 11 minutes, Martin Lowe's keycard and PIN. He accessed 14 documents. "All from Project Keystone," Sylvia said. "Every one." Ben scrolled down. Term sheet, due diligence summary, regulatory pre-clearance filing. Valuation model, the final one, not the draft that was shared with the broader team. He paused. "And this?" He stopped scrolling. The document name read KS Counterparty Threshold Minimums Board, Eyes Only. Douglas stared at it. That document contained the lowest acceptable terms Griffin Capital's board had authorized for the merger. The absolute floor. The number below which Douglas would walk away from the deal. It was the single most sensitive piece of information in the entire negotiation, the thing that in the wrong hands would allow a competitor to know exactly how much pressure to apply before the deal collapsed. "If Hargrove has that number," Douglas said, "they don't need to block the deal," Sylvia finished. "They just need to whisper it to the target company's advisors. Suggest that Griffin won't go higher. Create enough doubt that the target gets cold feet. She took her glasses off entirely. The merger falls apart on its own. No fingerprints. And Martin walks. With 40 million reasons to start over somewhere else. Sylvia set her glasses on the table. We need to know if this data has already been transmitted. Ben, already running it, Ben said, not looking up. Checking outbound data transfers from Martin's devices over the past 72 hours. Company phone laptop building Wi-Fi log. He typed for a moment. His company phone shows nothing unusual. Laptop same. Another pause. But there's a gap. What kind of gap? Thursday night between 1:04 and 2:51 a.m., Martin's company phone shows no activity. No calls, no data, nothing. That's consistent with him leaving it in his office and using a second device which matches what we see on the footage. A personal phone he brought in. One that never touched our network, Ben confirmed. Whatever he transmitted on that device. We can't see it from here. Douglas turned away from the screen and walked to the window again. He stood there with his arms crossed. The merger vote was at 10 tomorrow morning. 18 hours from now, the Griffin Capital Board would gather in the 40th floor boardroom and vote on the largest acquisition in the company's history. Martin Lowe would sit at that table. He would vote. He would smile and shake hands, and afterward he would probably suggest they all go to lunch. And somewhere in this city, Diana Holt was being held in a room she hadn't chosen to be in by people who needed her silent for exactly 18 more hours. We need to find where she is, Douglas said without turning from the window. Tonight. That means finding Conrad Briggs, Sylvia said. Martin's outside contact, we've traced the financial thread. She flipped back 2 pages in her legal pad. There's a consulting LLC registered in Delaware, 18 months old, no website, no employees. It's received 3 wire transfers totaling $180,000 from an account linked to a Hargrove subsidiary. The LLC's registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington that fronts for anyone who pays them. She looked up. But the LLC has a signatory. She turned the legal pad around. Douglas read the name. He didn't recognize it immediately, and then he did. Conrad Briggs had been a mid-level compliance officer at a financial firm that Griffin Capital had acquired 6 years ago. Douglas had never spoken to him directly, but Martin had managed the integration. Martin had known everyone who'd come through that acquisition. Martin brought him in, Douglas said. Martin built him, Sylvia said. Gave him the work, the contacts, the structure. Conrad is the cutout. If anything goes wrong, Martin points to Conrad. Conrad points to the LLC. The LLC points to Delaware. She paused. But Conrad is also the one with boots on the ground. If Diana is being held somewhere, Conrad is the one who arranged it. Can we find him? Ben looked up from his laptop. I can find the LLC's registered address and cross-reference any property leases or storage facilities linked to Briggs's known associates. It'll take a few hours. Do it, Douglas said. He turned from the window. Audrey was awake. She hadn't made a sound. She'd simply opened her eyes at some point and was sitting upright now, the blazer still around her shoulders, watching Douglas with the patient attention of someone who had learned not to interrupt adults when they were finally doing something useful. Did you find something? She asked. Yes, Douglas said, about the man who has my mom. Douglas crossed the room and sat down across from her properly, this time elbows on the table. We know who it is, he said, and we know why. We're working on where. Audrey absorbed this. Is she okay? It was the question he'd been avoiding in his own mind for the last 2 hours because the honest answer was, I don't know, and the honest answer felt insufficient for an 8-year-old who had done everything right. We're going to make sure she is, he said. It wasn't a promise exactly, but he said it like one. Audrey looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the front pocket of her backpack and took out a small photograph, wallet-sized, slightly bent at one corner. She set it on the table, facing Douglas. A woman in her mid-30s, dark-skinned, laughing at something off-camera. She was wearing a Griffin Capital employee lanyard, standing in what looked like a lobby, this lobby. She looked like Audrey around the eyes. "That's her," Audrey said. "So you know who you're looking for." Douglas picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. "My mom cleaned this office for 7 years. He had walked past this woman, this specific woman, this face 100 times, maybe more. And he had never once seen her." "I know who I'm looking for," he said quietly. He set the photograph down gently and did not give it back. At 1:15 p.m., Douglas Griffin walked into the 38th floor conference room for a scheduled budget review. Martin Lowe was already there. He was standing at the window with a coffee talking to Sandra from finance about something that made her laugh. He turned when Douglas came in, and his face did what it always did, opened up easy and warm, the face of a man who was genuinely glad to see you. "There he is," Martin said. "Thought you'd gone missing on us." "Got caught up," Douglas said. He shook Martin's hand. 12 years of handshakes. He knew the grip, firm 2 pumps the left hand coming up briefly to the elbow on important days. Today, it was the standard version. Unhurried, clean. Douglas held it a beat longer than usual. "Everything all right?" Martin asked. "Fine," Douglas said. "Long morning." He took his seat at the head of the table. There were 7 people in the room. Sandra, from finance to senior analyst, the head of operations, Martin Douglas's executive assistant, Janet, who took minutes, and a young associate named Phil, who always sat slightly too far from the table, as if preparing to leave at any moment. The budget review was a quarterly routine. Numbers Douglas knew already. Projections he'd signed off on 2 weeks ago. He let the presentation run and watched the slides and said the right things at the right moments. Good push that the next quarter, let's revisit the infrastructure line. And the whole time he watched Martin. Not directly. He'd spent 20 years reading rooms, and he knew how to look at someone without looking at them. You watch the hands. You watch the moments between sentences when a person thinks no one is paying attention. Martin's hands were relaxed. That was the thing. Douglas had expected he didn't know what he'd expected. A tell. Some small crack in the performance. A pen clicked too many times, a glance at the phone. A laugh that came out a half-second wrong. There was nothing. Martin sat with his forearms on the table and made 2 useful observations about the Q3 numbers, and asked Sandra a follow-up question about vendor contracts that was... Douglas had to admit exactly the right question. He smiled at Phil's minor fumble over a slide transition. He deferred to Douglas twice on points where he could easily have held the floor. He was, as he had always been, the best version of a trusted deputy, and Douglas sat at the head of the table and thought about 11 minutes in a server room. He thought about 14 documents. He thought about KS Counterparty Threshold Minimums Board eyes only, and a personal phone that had never touched the company network. He thought about Diana Holt, standing at a security desk at 1:15 in the morning, scared, looking over her shoulder. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it. After the meeting broke up, Martin fell into step beside Douglas in the corridor the way he always did, the easy, collegial walk toward the elevators that had characterized the end of 100 meetings over 12 years. They'd debriefed this way since the beginning. It was the kind of habit that had stopped being conscious long ago. "Good session," Martin said. "Sandra's sharper than she was 6 months ago." "She is," Douglas agreed. "You see the weather tonight, they're saying ice." "I heard." "Big day tomorrow." Martin glanced sideways. "You ready?" Douglas looked at him. "For the vote. 10 years ago, you were running this thing out of 2 floors on Wacker Drive," Martin said. "Tomorrow, we close a $2 billion merger." He shook his head with a kind of fond disbelief. "You built something real, Douglas." "We built something" was what he usually said. Today he'd said you. Douglas filed that away. "Couldn't have done it without the right people around me," Douglas said. Martin nodded satisfied, like a man who knew he was one of those people. They reached the elevator bank. Martin pressed the button for 36. "Get some sleep tonight," Martin said. "Big morning." "You too," Douglas said. The elevator came. Martin stepped in. He turned around that easy, familiar face, the face of 12 years, and raised a hand. "See you at 10, he said. The doors closed. Douglas stood at the elevator bank and did not move for a moment. He thought about the first time he'd ever doubted someone he trusted completely. A business partner years ago, before Griffin Capital existed. A man he'd brought in on a handshake, and who had walked out with half their client list 18 months later. Douglas had not seen it coming then either. He'd told himself afterward that he should have, that there had been signs, small ones, that he'd explained away because it was easier to explain them away than to consider the alternative. He had told himself he'd never do that again. And then he had spent 12 years with Martin Lowe, and somewhere along the way he had started explaining things away again. Small things. The way Martin sometimes took calls outside away from the office. The way certain conversations ended just slightly before Douglas entered a room. Nothing he could name. Nothing he'd ever named. He'd called it trust. He pressed the button for the lobby. Downstairs, in Earl's office, Audrey was doing homework. She had taken a notebook from her backpack and was working through something math Douglas thought from the column of numbers visible on the page. Earl was at his monitors. Ben Chu was still at his laptop, 3 empty coffee cups beside him now. Douglas came in and closed the door. "Anything?" he asked Ben. "Getting close," Ben said. Found 2 properties connected to Briggs through a shell company registered to his brother-in-law. One's a storage facility in Bridgeport. One's a warehouse space in Pullman, leased 8 months ago, no declared tenant. He looked up. The Pullman one has had utility usage consistent with occupancy for the last 4 days. Douglas looked at Sylvia, who was in the corner chair with her legal pad. "Pullman," she said, "that's 20 minutes south. We need to confirm before we move," Douglas said. "If we send police to the wrong location and Martin hears about it, he panics," Sylvia said. "And Diana becomes a liability instead of a witness." She paused. "We need Martin to confirm it himself." The room was quiet. Audrey looked up from her homework. "You could make him think something went wrong," she said. Everyone looked at her. She set her pencil down, unhurried. "My mom told me once that the best way to find out if someone's hiding something is to scare them a little. She said scared people make mistakes." She looked at Douglas. "If he thinks something went wrong with the place where he has her, he'll check on it right." Douglas looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at Audrey. "She's not wrong," Sylvia said. Audrey picked her pencil back up. "I'm in 4th grade," she said without looking up. "We learn about cause and effect." Outside, the first thin layer of ice was beginning to settle on the Chicago streets, quiet and colorless, the way dangerous things often arrive. Inside Earl's small office, a plan was beginning to take shape. Douglas sat down, pulled out his phone, and looked at Diana's photograph one more time. "My mom cleaned this office for 7 years. He put the phone away. Tomorrow at 10, the board would vote on the biggest deal of his career. But tonight he had something more important to do. He was going to learn at last how to see the people who had been standing right in front of him all along. At 3:40 p.m., Martin Lowe's phone buzzed. He was alone in his office on the 36th floor, door closed, jacket off. He'd been at his desk for 40 minutes, doing nothing that looked like work, staring at his screen, moving papers, waiting. The kind of waiting that has a specific quality to it, the kind where every sound from the corridor makes you look up. The message came through on his personal phone. The small dark one. Problem. Call me. 2 words from Conrad Briggs. Martin read them twice. Then he stood up, walked to his window and stood with his back to the door. He called. It rang once. "We have a situation," Conrad said. "The woman. She's asking for a doctor, says she's having chest pains. My guy on site doesn't know what to do with that." "It's nothing," Martin said low and tight. "She's stalling." "Maybe. But if something actually happens to her before tomorrow morning, we've got a very different problem on our hands." Martin pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "She needs to hold for 18 more hours, that's all. After the vote clears, I wire the last payment and you cut her loose. Clean. No trail." "I know the plan," Conrad said. "I'm telling you my guy is nervous. Tell your guy to stay calm and stay put." A pause. "You sure about Pullman? Because if anyone starts—" "No one is looking at Pullman," Martin said. "No one is looking at anything. The old man is upstairs preparing for tomorrow, and that's all he's doing." He exhaled. 18 hours, Conrad. Tell your man to sit tight and keep her comfortable. Water, food, whatever she needs. Just keep her quiet." He ended the call. He stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the city going gray with ice. Then he straightened his shoulders, walked back to his desk, and put the personal phone in his inside jacket pocket. He picked up his company phone and checked his calendar for tomorrow. 10:00 a.m. Project Keystone Board vote. He looked at it the way a man looks at a finish line. 3 floors below, in Earl's office, Ben Chu pulled off his headphones. "Got it," he said. The room went still. Ben had spent the last 90 minutes setting up a relay, a burner number routed through 3 anonymizing layers, feeding into a recorded line untraceable back to Griffin Capital Tower. The call had been placed from that number. The voice on the other end had been a contact of Sylvia's, a former federal investigator named Ray, who did this kind of work occasionally and charged accordingly and never asked for details he didn't need. Ray had said, "Problem. Call me." And Martin had called back within 40 seconds. "Location confirmed," Sylvia asked. "He said Pullman," Ben said. Said it by name, and he referenced keeping her there through tomorrow morning. He pulled up the recording, played back the relevant section. Martin's voice low and controlled. "No one is looking at Pullman. No one is looking at anything." Douglas stood with his arms at his sides and listened to the playback. He'd known intellectually since the server room footage. He'd known since the backup drive. But hearing the voice, Martin's voice, the voice he'd known for 12 years, the voice that had just said, "See you at 10 in an elevator," was a different thing entirely. It sat in his chest like a stone. "He mentioned a man on site," Sylvia said. "Conrad has someone physically at the location." "1 person," Earl said. "Probably." "Probably," Sylvia agreed. "We can't go in without confirmation of Diana's exact location within the building, and we can't risk spooking whoever's inside." She looked at Douglas. "We need to call Detective Reyes." Douglas nodded. "Do it." Sylvia had already been in contact with Andrea Reyes, a detective with the Chicago PD's Financial Crimes Unit, who had worked with Sylvia's firm twice before, and who crucially understood the particular complexity of cases where the evidence had been gathered by people who were not the police, and where the chain of custody needed to be handled with extreme care. Sylvia stepped into the corridor to make the call. The room felt smaller without her. Audrey had put her homework away. She was sitting with the blazer still around her shoulders, watching Douglas. "You heard him," she said. "He knows where she is." "Yes." "So, you can get her tonight." "We're working on it." She nodded slowly. Then, and it was the first time all day that something in her composure shifted, she looked down at her hands. "She was scared," Audrey said quietly. "That night. I could tell. even though she was trying not to show me. A pause. She made the rice the way I like it with the butter mixed in. She only does that when she's trying to make me feel okay. Another pause. I didn't say anything. I just ate it, and I let her think I didn't notice. Douglas sat down across from her. He didn't say anything either. He just sat. She does that for me sometimes, Audrey continued. Tries to protect me from things. I do it back. We kind of take turns. She looked up. She's going to be embarrassed when she finds out I came here by myself. She's going to be upset, and then she's going to hug me for a really long time. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. I'm ready for that. Douglas looked at this child, this 8-year-old girl who had ridden the bus downtown alone on a Sunday morning with a folded piece of paper and a photograph and a plan, and felt something move in him that hadn't moved in a long time. He thought about his own daughter. She was 23 now, living in Seattle, working at an architecture firm. They talked on holidays and sometimes in between, but not often. He had missed things he knew that in the vague, managed way he allowed himself to know it. School plays, a graduation, a surgery she'd had at 19 that she'd told him about afterward, not before, because she'd known he was in the middle of a deal and hadn't wanted to interrupt. She'd said it was fine. He'd believed her because it was easier. He looked at Audrey and thought some children spend their whole childhood protecting adults from the cost of paying attention. She's not going to be embarrassed, Douglas said. She's going to be proud. Audrey looked at him. You found the right person, he said. She told you to find someone who matters. You did. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't know her name this morning. No, he said, I didn't. Do you know it now? Diana, he said. Diana Holt. Audrey held his gaze for a long moment. Then she gave a single small nod, the nod of someone checking something off a list they'd been keeping privately. At 4:22 p.m., Sylvia came back in. Reyes is on board, she said. She's pulling a team together for tonight. Wants to move after midnight, less visibility, less risk of Briggs's man making a run for it if he spots anything outside. She looked at Douglas. She needs the recording, the footage, the drive, everything. She'll have it, Douglas said. There's one more thing. Sylvia paused. Reyes wants a reason to hold Martin tonight, before the warehouse op. She doesn't want him in a position to make calls once the team moves in. On what grounds? Security's fraud. What we have from the drive is enough for a preliminary hold. It won't stick permanently without the federal investigation behind it, but it buys us tonight. Sylvia looked at Douglas steadily. She needs you to authorize the release of the proprietary documents to her office, officially, as the aggrieved party. Douglas thought about Martin in the elevator. See you at 10. Yes, he said. Authorize it. Sylvia wrote something on her legal pad and tore the page off cleanly. That was when the door opened. Not Sylvia returning, she was already in the room. Not Earl, he was at his monitors. A young woman Douglas didn't recognize immediately, and then did one of Martin's junior analysts, a second-year associate named Kelly. She had clearly walked down from the executive floor with a question about tomorrow's board materials, and had opened the door to what she thought was a standard security office. She looked at the room. Douglas, Sylvia, Ben's 3 laptops, the legal pads, the gray drive case on the table. She looked at Audrey. She looked at Douglas. I'm sorry, I was looking for... She stopped. I'll come back. Kelly, Douglas said. She stopped in the doorway. Did Martin send you down here? A pause. Half a second too long. No, the board package for tomorrow. I needed to confirm the distribution list with Earl. Douglas looked at Earl. Earl shook his head slightly. That request would normally go through Janet, Douglas said evenly. Not Earl. Kelly's face did not change, but her right hand holding the doorframe tightened very slightly. I must have gotten confused, she said. I'll check with Janet. She pulled the door closed. The room was silent. Sylvia was already writing on a new page of her legal pad. "How long has she been on Martin's team?" Douglas asked Earl. 8 months, Earl said. He was already at his monitor pulling her access logs. Sylvia tore the page off and slid it across the table to Douglas. One word: accelerate. Douglas picked up his phone and called Detective Reyes directly. "Change of plan," he said. "We don't wait until midnight." Detective Andrea Reyes arrived at Griffin Capitol Tower at 5:15 p.m. She came through the parking structure entrance, Earl's idea, in a plain gray coat, no badge visible, carrying a laptop bag that contained considerably more than a laptop. She was 50 compact with close-cropped hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades walking into rooms where something had already gone wrong. She shook Douglas's hand. Then she looked at Audrey. "This is the young lady who started all this," she said. "Yes," Douglas said. Reyes looked at Audrey with the direct, respectful attention of someone who had long ago stopped underestimating children. "You did good," she said simply. Then she set her bag on the table and got to work. The plan took 40 minutes to build and another 20 to stress test. Reyes laid it out on a whiteboard. Earl wheeled in from the storage room dry erase markers, clean columns, no names written in full. She'd brought 2 members of her team, a detective named Osei, tall and quiet, who handled the operational logistics, and a tech specialist named Flores, who had worked financial crimes for 9 years, and whose expression throughout the entire briefing suggested she had seen worse, though she was too professional to say so. The problem, as Reyes framed it, was threefold. First, they needed to neutralize Martin before the warehouse operation began, because a man with a personal phone and a contact on site could end Diana Holt's life with 2 words. Second, they needed to neutralize Kelly the analyst before she could report back to Martin that something was happening in the building. Third, they needed to extract Diana without triggering Conrad Briggs or his man on site into a response that could not be undone. "The recording gives us enough for a securities fraud hold on Martin," Reyes said, tapping the whiteboard. "We execute that first. My people will pick him up at his residence. He left the building at 4:55, Earl confirmed. We do it quietly. No marked cars, no drama. He'll be in a room downtown within the hour." "What about his phone?" Sylvia asked. "We take the personal device the moment we have him, before he makes a call." Reyes looked at Ben. "Can you tell us if he's tried to contact Conrad in the last 30 minutes? Ben checked. 2 texts sent at 4:48 p.m. to the same number that called him earlier. Content unknown encrypted messaging app, but no calls since. "He's managing it by text," Reyes said. "That means Conrad doesn't know there's a problem yet." "Good." She moved to the second column. "The analyst, Kelly. We need her contained without alerting Martin. If she's been watching this office for him, she'll report the moment she leaves the building." "She's still in the building," Earl said, looking at his monitor. "Badged back to the 36th floor at 4:31. Hasn't left." "Can you pull her badge access?" Reyes asked. "Already done," Earl said. "She can't exit the building without coming through me." Reyes nodded. "When we're ready to move, we bring her down here and my people have a conversation with her. She's likely not criminal. She's probably just been passing observations to Martin the way junior staff sometimes do for senior people they think they're loyal to. But she doesn't leave until Diana is out." The third column was the warehouse. Reyes turned to Osei. He stepped forward and pulled up a satellite image on his tablet, the Pullman warehouse. A long gray rectangle backing onto a freight rail spur, 3 visible entry points, minimal surrounding foot traffic at night. "We've driven past twice in the last hour," Osei said. "One vehicle in the lot, a black SUV plates, registered to a rental company under a name that links back to one of Conrad's shell entities. One heat signature visible through the north wall on the thermal scan, ground floor east end. One person on site," Reyes said. consistent with what we heard on the recording. She looked at Douglas. We go in at 7. Reyes's team, too, marked units, staged 3 blocks out an ambulance on standby because we don't know her condition. Douglas looked at the thermal image. 1 small heat signature, East End, ground floor. Diana Holt in a warehouse in Pullman because she'd been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time and had refused to look away. She'll need a doctor, Audrey said. Everyone looked at her. She has asthma, Audrey said. Not bad, but if she's been somewhere cold and she's been scared, she'll need her inhaler or something like it. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small blue inhaler. This is her spare. She keeps one at home and one at work. I brought the home one. Reyes took it carefully. I'll make sure the paramedics know. Audrey nodded and sat back. The trap for Conrad's man on site was the most delicate piece. If they went in hard-marked cars lights, the full approach, Conrad's man had time to make a call, send a text, do something irreversible. They needed him passive before he knew what was happening. We used the same mechanism we used on Martin, Reyes said. A message from Conrad's number, or close enough telling the man on site to step outside and move the vehicle to a different spot. Standard operational cover. He steps out, my people are there. Can you spoof Conrad's number? Douglas asked. We don't need to, Flores said, speaking for the first time. She had a tablet out running something. Conrad Briggs made a call to the on-site number at 2:17 p.m. Today, from a number registered to his Shell LLC. That number is active, and we have the outgoing pattern. She looked up. With the right equipment, we can send a text from that number. Short, consistent with how Conrad communicates. Something like, move the car to the south lot. Precaution. He'll do it, Earl asked. If he's been waiting in a warehouse all day following instructions from a man he trusts, Reyes said yes. People in that position do what they're told. She paused. We've done this before. Douglas looked around the room. Sylvia with her legal pad. Ben with his laptops. Earl at his monitors. Reyes and her team at the whiteboard. Audrey in her chair backpack on her lap listening to every word. He thought about how none of this would exist without the folded piece of paper in a coat pocket. Without a woman who had cleaned his office for 7 years making a choice in a corridor to not look away. Without an 8-year-old girl who had decided at 8 years old that some things were worth walking into a strange building alone to fix. One more thing, Douglas said. Everyone looked at him. When we go to Pullman tonight, I'm going. Reyes looked at him steadily. Mr. Griffin, she brought this to me, Douglas said. She came to this building and she gave it to me and she told me to find her mother. He looked at Reyes. I'm not waiting in this office for a phone call. I'll stay back. I'll stay in the car. I'll do whatever you need me to do. But I'm there. Reyes held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Audrey. Audrey looked at Douglas. Something passed across her face, not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. Okay, Reyes said. You stay in the vehicle. You don't move until I say. Understood. At 6:10 p.m., Earl's phone rang. He answered, listened, said 3 words, confirmed thank you, and hung up. They have Martin, he said. The room exhaled. Personal phone was on him, Earl continued. Taken at the door. He hasn't made a call in the last 40 minutes. Sylvia wrote something on her legal pad and put her pen down. Douglas stood up and put his jacket on. He looked at Audrey. You're staying here with Earl, he said. Earl will be with you the entire time. The moment we have your mother, you'll be the first person I call. Audrey stood up too. She straightened her yellow coat, the one with the torn pockets stitched up with mismatched thread. She picked up her backpack. Then she crossed the room and stood in front of Douglas. She was very small next to him. The top of her head came to his chest. She looked up at him with those steady, careful eyes. "My mom cleaned this office for 7 years," she said, one last time. The refrain worn smooth now from use. "You know her name now." "Diana," he said. "Diana Holt." Audrey held out her hand. He shook it properly, the way you shake the hand of someone who has done something serious and real. She shook back with a grip that meant it. "Go find her," Audrey said. Douglas picked up his coat and walked out the door. The drive to Pullman took 19 minutes. Douglas sat in the back of an unmarked sedan with Sylvia beside him and Osei at the wheel. The city thinned as they pushed south streetlights. Fewer buildings lowered the neighborhoods, giving way to flat industrial ground and the distant rhythm of freight rail. Nobody spoke much. Sylvia had her legal pad closed on her lap for once. Douglas kept his hand off his phone. He thought about tomorrow, the board, the 10 o'clock vote, the $2 billion deal that had been 11 months in the making. He found sitting in that car on the way to a warehouse that he cared about it considerably less than he had this morning. That was a new feeling. He filed it away. Reyes was already on site when they arrived. 2 unmarked vehicles staged in the shadow of a rail depot 3 blocks north. A third car at the south end. The ambulance 2 blocks east, lights off, engine running. "You stay here," Osei said, cutting the engine. Not unkindly, just clearly. "I'll stay here," Douglas said. The warehouse was visible from where they were parked. A long low shape against the gray-black sky, a single sodium lamp over the loading dock casting yellow light on cracked asphalt. The black SUV sat in the north lot exactly where the thermal scan had shown it. At 7:04 p.m., Flores sent the text from Conrad's number, "Move the car to the south lot." Precaution. They waited. At 7:09, the warehouse side door opened. A heavy-set man in a dark jacket came out moving without urgency, the unhurried walk of someone following a routine instruction from someone he trusted. He got 3 steps from the SUV. Reyes's team moved from 2 directions. Clean, fast practiced. The man said something Douglas couldn't hear. Then he was on the ground, hands being secured, and it was over. Reyes and 2 officers went in through the side door. 60 seconds passed. 90. His phone buzzed. "She's here. She's okay. Stand by." Douglas put the phone on his knee and pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth. Sylvia put her hand briefly on his arm and then took it back. At 7:23 p.m., the loading dock door rolled up. The paramedics went in with a stretcher. Douglas watched the sodium lamp make its small yellow circle, and he watched the man on the ground with his hands zip-tied, and he thought about what it meant that Conrad had trusted a woman's life to someone who moved a car without asking why. At 7:31 p.m., they brought Diana out. She was on the stretcher, but sitting up, that was the first thing he registered. Upright, alert. Foil blanket around her shoulders, oxygen mask on her face, eyes moving rapidly like someone coming back from a very dark place. Douglas's door was open before he fully decided to open it. Osei put a hand up. Douglas stopped with one foot on the asphalt. He held the door and watched. Reyes walked alongside the stretcher and leaned down to say something. Diana nodded, quick, emphatic. Then Reyes held up her phone and Diana looked at the screen. Earl had sent a photo. Audrey in the security office, backpack on the table, homework, spread out looking at the camera, with the patient expression of a girl who had decided this situation called for stillness. Diana's hand came up and covered her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Just once. Then the paramedics were moving again and the ambulance doors were closing and the lights were coming on. Douglas stood beside the car and watched it pull out. He realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out. That was when it almost fell apart. Sylvia's phone rang. She answered, listened, said Douglas. He took the phone. It was Ben. Martin had a second device, Ben said. When they picked him up, he still had the phone for 40 seconds before they cuffed him. He placed a call at 5:58 p.m. 16 seconds. It connected. Who did he call? Conrad Briggs, a personal number we hadn't identified. Douglas looked at the warehouse. Does Reyes know? Calling her now. He handed the phone back and walked fast toward Reyes. She was already coming out the side door radio at her ear. I heard, she said. Flores Conrad's location, she said into the radio. Last known River North Hotel. Team is en route. If Conrad ran, Douglas started. We have his financials, his shell companies, his face on your building's footage, Reyes said steadily. He doesn't run far. She looked at Douglas. Diana is in that ambulance. That's what matters tonight. He stood in the Pullman parking lot and understood fully that you could do everything right and still have 16 seconds go wrong at the end. He had no way to know what Martin had said. He had no way to know if Conrad had heard enough to act. Reyes's radio crackled. Target in custody, hotel lobby, he hadn't packed. Douglas closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and called Earl. Earl answered immediately. We have her, Douglas said. She's in the ambulance. She's okay. Tell Audrey. A shuffling sound. Then the voice he already knew well after only 1 day. Did you find her? Audrey asked. We found her. She's safe. She's on her way to the hospital just to check her out. You'll see her tonight. A silence. Not the silence of disbelief. The silence of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for 3 days and has just been told they can put it down. Okay, Audrey said very quietly. Okay. Audrey, Douglas said. Yes. You were right. Scared people make mistakes. A small pause. My mom told me that. She sounds like a very smart woman. Another pause. Shorter this time. She is, Audrey said. Douglas ended the call and stood for a moment in the cold, the sodium lamp still making its yellow circle the freight rail. Somewhere in the dark, the city a dull orange glow against the low sky. Then he got back in the car. Martin Lowe had been in the room for 40 minutes before Douglas arrived. Gray walls. A table bolted to the floor. Fluorescent light that made everything look slightly more permanent than it was. The kind of room designed to remind you that the thing you've been running from has finally stopped moving. Martin was sitting with his hands folded on the table. He looked up when Douglas came in. For 1 fraction of a second, something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, something more complicated. Something that looked almost like relief, the way a person looks when the thing they've been bracing for finally arrives and they no longer have to brace for it. Then it closed up again. Douglas, he said. Douglas pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He'd asked Reyes for 10 minutes alone before the formal interrogation began. She'd given him 5. He put nothing on the table. No files, no phone, no legal pad. Just himself, and 12 years of shared history and the specific silence of a room where the truth had already been established, and both people knew it. You didn't have to come down here, Martin said. I know. This is a lawyer conversation now. I'm not here to interrogate you, Douglas said. Reyes will do that. He paused. I needed to understand something. Martin waited. When did it start? Douglas asked. A long silence. Martin looked at his hands. 18 months ago, he said finally. Hargrove approached through an intermediary, framed as consulting at first. Market positioning. Nothing that felt... He stopped, chose his word, catastrophic. But it became catastrophic. Things escalated. He said it the way people say it, as if escalation is something that happens to you rather than something you choose at each small fork in the road. Project Keystone, Douglas said. The threshold minimums. The board eyes only document. He kept his voice level. He was past Angry had moved through it somewhere on the drive back from Pullman and come out the other side into something quieter and colder. You knew what that document would do to the deal. I knew, Martin said. Then why? Martin was quiet for a long time, long enough that Douglas thought he wasn't going to answer. You know what it's like, Martin said finally, to spend 12 years building something and realize that everything you've built belongs to someone else's name. He looked up. Your name is on the building, literally, Griffin Capital. I've been here since year 2, every room, every decision, every deal. A pause. My exit clause caps me at $2 million. I know what your contract says. $2 million after 12 years? He looked at Douglas with something between defiance and shame. Hargrove was offering 40 for 18 months of information and 1 document. He exhaled slowly. I told myself it wasn't personal. You had a woman detained, Douglas said. A woman who cleans offices for a living. You had her taken and held in a warehouse for 3 days because she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. He kept his voice quiet. That was the hardest part. Her 8-year-old daughter has been alone since Thursday night. Martin's jaw tightened. That wasn't supposed to happen, he said. Which part? Conrad was supposed to... He stopped. Conrad was supposed to handle it cleanly, Douglas said. Keep her somewhere comfortable. Make sure she stayed quiet for 18 hours and then cut her loose. He looked at Martin steadily. You've been in enough deals to know how these things work once they start. You knew that. Martin said nothing. She has asthma, Douglas said. Her daughter brought her spare inhaler to my building in her school backpack. An 8-year-old thought of that. He paused. Did you know there was a child? Something shifted in Martin's face. Not a breaking nothing so clean. More like a slow, quiet settling. I didn't know about the child, he said. You didn't ask. Martin looked at his hands. That's what I needed to understand, Douglas said. Not the money, not Hargrove. I can follow that logic even if I don't agree with it. I needed to know whether you had that information and set it aside or whether you simply never looked for it. A long silence. I didn't look, Martin said. Quietly, like a confession to something larger than a crime. Douglas sat back. He looked at this man he had known for 12 years who had been at his right hand at his wedding across from him in 100 rooms, and he tried to find something he could understand. Not excuse, not minimize. Just understand fully the way you have to understand something completely before you can put it down. He found something, not much, but something. You'll cooperate with the federal investigation, Douglas said. Fully. Conrad Hargrove, the intermediary, every piece. Martin looked up. I'm not offering you anything in exchange, Douglas said. I'm telling you it's the right thing to do, and that you know it. He stood and pushed in his chair. Reyes comes through that door in 3 minutes and you tell her everything. He walked to the door. The merger vote is at 10 tomorrow morning, he said, hand on the frame. It will proceed without you. The deal will close. He paused. 12 years, he said without turning. And I never knew her name either. Diana Holt. 7 years she cleaned my building and I walked past her 100 times and I never asked. A beat. We both failed her. The difference is what we do next. He opened the door and walked out. Reyes was waiting in the corridor. She read his face. He'll talk. He'll talk, Douglas said. She nodded once and went in. Sylvia fell into step beside Douglas as he walked toward the exit. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He went to the hospital. It was past 9 when he arrived. Northwestern Memorial, 4th floor, a room at the end of a quiet corridor. A nurse said family only. Sylvia appeared, had a brief conversation with the nurse, and Douglas was allowed through. He stood in the doorway. Diana Holt was propped up in the bed, oxygen monitor on her finger water on the Trey Hospital bracelet still on her wrist. Eyes closed, breathing steady. Audrey was on the bed beside her, not in a chair pulled close. On the bed, curled against her mother's side yellow coat, still on the butterfly keychain somewhere under the blanket. Diana's arm was around her. Neither of them was fully asleep. They were in that particular stillness that comes after a long ordeal when the body has finally been given permission to stop. Douglas stood in the doorway and did not go in. He watched Diana hold her daughter and thought about 7 years of late nights and silent corridors and offices cleaned while the building slept. He thought about a woman who had seen something wrong and had not looked away, who had gone home frightened and made rice with butter and said "I love you" 3 times and pressed a folded piece of paper into a coat pocket, just in case. He had walked past her 100 times. He would not do that again. Diana opened her eyes. She turned her head and saw him. He'd expected something hard in her face, the earned anger of a woman who had nearly disappeared from the world because she worked in a building where nobody knew her name, something he would carry going forward. Instead, she just looked at him, steadily, with the same quality of attention he'd seen in her daughter's face all day and recognized now as something they shared. Audrey stirred, looked up at her mother, followed her gaze to the door. "You came," Audrey said. "I came," Douglas said. He stepped into the room and pulled a chair close, not across a desk, not at a professional distance. Close. "I need to say something," he said. "Not tomorrow in an official setting, now." Diana waited. "I have walked past you in that building more times than I can count," he said. "I have benefited from your work every single day for 7 years without once asking your name or thanking you for what you do." He held her gaze. "That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Diana looked at her daughter, then back at him. "My daughter came to find you," she said. "Of all the people she could have gone to." A pause. "She doesn't trust easily. She gave you a chance." Her voice was quiet but clear. "Don't waste it." "I won't," Douglas said. Audrey looked at him from her mother's side, checking, verifying. Then she gave him that single small nod, the one that meant confirmed. Acceptable. He left the hospital just before 11. The ice had settled fully on the Chicago streets, thin and even glowing faintly blue under the streetlights. He stood on the sidewalk and called his daughter in Seattle. It rang 4 times. "Dad," surprised. He didn't call late. "I just wanted to hear your voice," he said. A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I've been not paying attention to some things for a while. I wanted to start." He looked up at the orange-edged sky. "I'll call you tomorrow properly. I just needed to say it tonight." A beat of silence. Then quietly, "Okay, Dad. Go back to sleep. I love you." "Love you too," she said. And hung up. Douglas put his phone away and stood on the icy sidewalk for a long moment. Then he got in the car and went home. The merger vote passed at 10:23 a.m. unanimous. 7 board members, 7 votes. The deal that had taken 11 months to build survived the night intact, survived. Martin survived. Hargrove survived 16 seconds in a hallway. Douglas sat at the head of the table and watched the hands go up and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, not triumph exactly, something quieter, the satisfaction of a thing that was supposed to hold holding. Afterward, people shook his hand and said the right things. He thanked them and meant it less than usual, and moved through the room with the particular efficiency of a man who has somewhere else to be. He had somewhere else to be. Diana was discharged from Northwestern Memorial at 11:40 a.m. Sylvia had arranged a car. Earl had come personally, which was not in his job description and which nobody questioned. Audrey sat in the back seat between her mother and Earl with the yellow coat on and the backpack on her lap, the butterfly keychain catching the late morning light. Douglas met them at the building. Not the lobby, he'd thought about that, about the marble floor and the security desk and the particular weight of that space, and he'd decided against it. He met them in the small conference room off Earl's office instead. The same room where Audrey had sat down 3 days ago with her homework and her hot chocolate and her 2 folded pieces of paper. Diana walked in slowly. Not weakened exactly, but careful, the way people move when they've been reminded that their body is a thing that can be threatened. She looked around the room. At the whiteboard Reyes had used, still faintly marked. At the monitors. At the table where her daughter had apparently spent most of Sunday doing 4th grade math. She looked at Douglas. "Thank you," she said. "Thank your daughter," Douglas said. She did this. Diana looked at Audrey. Audrey looked at the floor briefly the way children do when they're trying not to appear proud of themselves. "I know," Diana said softly. "I know she did." Douglas had asked Sylvia to prepare 2 things. The first was a formal letter on Griffin capital letterhead, signed by Douglas confirming Diana Holt's continued employment, her immediate promotion to Director of Facilities Operations, and a salary adjustment that reflected both the new title and 7 years of service that had not been adequately recognized. Sylvia had added a clause ensuring Diana's position was protected from any restructuring connected to the Hargrove investigation. She had also, without being asked, included full health care coverage for Audrey. Douglas slid the letter across the table. Diana read it once, then again. Her face did not change dramatically. She was not a woman given to dramatic reactions, which was something Douglas was beginning to understand about her. But her right hand holding the page tightened slightly at the corner. "This is real," she said, not a question exactly. "It's real," Douglas said. She set the letter down. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "I didn't do what I did for a promotion," she said. "I know that," Douglas said. "That's exactly why you're getting one." A beat of silence. Then something moved in Diana's face, not quite a smile, but related to one. The look of a person who has been told the truth and recognizes it. She picked the letter back up and folded it carefully. The second thing Douglas had asked Sylvia to prepare was still in his jacket pocket. He took it out after Diana had read the letter, a single folded page, different paper, handwritten rather than typed. He put it on the table in front of Audrey. She looked at it, then at him. "Go ahead," he said. She unfolded it. It was a letter of establishment, 1-page plain language, no legal jargon. It described the creation of the Diana and Audrey Holt Scholarship Fund endowed by Griffin Capital, providing full university scholarships annually to students from Chicago's South Side neighborhoods who demonstrated academic promise and financial need. Initial endowment, $2 million. First awards to be made the following academic year. At the bottom, a single handwritten line in Douglas's own writing, "For the people who show up and do not look away." Audrey read it slowly, all the way through. Then she read it again. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Not crying, not quite, but close to it in the way that means something has landed somewhere deep. "It has our names," she said. "It has your names," Douglas said. She looked at her mother. Diana was already looking at her. Something passed between them. The specific wordless communication of 2 people who have been through something together and have come out the other side and are now quietly taking stock of where they stand. Diana put her arm around Audrey's shoulders. Audrey leaned in. 3 months later, the federal investigation into Hargrove Industries became public. It was the kind of story that runs for weeks: corporate espionage, a CFO, a $40 million bribe, 3 Hargrove board members, 2 regulatory officials who had been on Hargrove's payroll for years. Martin Lowe cooperated fully, as Douglas had said he would. Conrad Briggs took a plea. Kelly, the junior analyst, was not charged. She had been passing minor observations to Martin without understanding the full picture exactly as Reyes had suspected. The Griffin Capital merger closed on schedule. The integration took the rest of the year. Douglas restructured the executive team carefully. He hired 2 new senior directors. He learned their names before he learned their titles, which was a small thing and which he made a point of. He had lunch with his daughter in Seattle in February. They talked for 3 hours. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 4 years, and it was by some margin the best. On a Tuesday in April, Douglas arrived at the office at his usual time. He stepped off the elevator at the 40th floor. He walked past the executive suite, past Janet's desk down the corridor toward the boardroom. He stopped. At the end of the corridor, a woman was cleaning the window, standing on a step stool with a cloth working methodically from top to bottom, the morning light coming through in long, clean streaks behind her. She was not Diana. Diana was in an office 3 floors down with her name on the door, and a coffee maker she'd requested, and a small framed photograph of Audrey on her desk. Douglas didn't know this woman's name. He walked toward her. "Good morning," he said. She turned, slightly startled. She was in her 40s, with tired eyes and a careful expression, the expression of someone who is accustomed to being invisible. "Good morning, sir," she said. "I'm Douglas Griffin," he said. "I own the building." She blinked. "I know, sir." "I don't know your name," he said. "I'd like to." A pause. The cloth still in her hand. The morning light still coming through the clean glass behind her. "Patricia," she said. "Patricia Wells." "Patricia," he said, "thank you for your work." She looked at him for a moment, not with suspicion, not with surprise exactly, but with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. The look of a person deciding whether something is real. She gave a small, dignified nod. "Thank you, Mr. Griffin," she said. He walked on toward the boardroom. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of the cloth moving against the glass, steady, practiced, unhurried, and the light came through clean and clear and fell across the corridor floor in long, warm stripes the way it did every morning in this building, seen or unseen, whether anyone was looking or not. There is a kind of courage that asks for no audience. It shows up before anyone else is awake, does what needs doing, and goes home. It sees wrong things and does not look away. It puts a folded piece of paper in a coat pocket and trusts that someone somewhere will be worth giving it to. Diana Holt had that courage. Audrey Holt carried it across the city at 8 years old. The question this story asks of all of us is simple. Who have we been walking past? Whose name have we never learned? Whose work have we benefited from without once saying thank you? It is never too late to stop, to look, to ask. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who deserved to be seen, leave a comment and tell us. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us about someone in your life who shows up quietly and does the work. We read every word, and if you haven't subscribed yet, join us because every week we bring you stories about the kind of courage that doesn't make the news but changes lives anyway.